A peaceful village and a shocking crime nestled in the vast, rugged expanse of Montana, Cedar Hollow seemed like a slice of untouched Americana. With its rolling plains, picturesque forests, and a tight-knit community of just over 300 residents, the town prided itself on peace, simplicity, and a slower pace of life. For decades, Cedar Hollow had been known for its postcard-perfect beauty and friendly, humble residents. People here knew their neighbors, left their doors unlocked, and gathered at O'Malley's Diner on Sunday mornings for coffee and gossip. But this ideal facade would be shattered in the early hours of a frosty October morning when darkness crept into their safe little world. The peace that had defined Cedar Hollow for so long was suddenly and brutally upended with the discovery of a lifeless body deep in the woods. The body of Melissa Carter, a wealthy woman who had recently moved to the town seeking solitude. Melissa Carter's presence in Cedar Hollow had always been somewhat of an anomaly. Unlike the other residents of the town, she was an outsider, a socialite from Manhattan who had left behind the bright lights of the big city after her high-profile divorce. When she bought an imposing wood and glass cabin at the edge of the forest, its modern architecture clashing with the rustic charm of neighboring farmhouses, she became the subject of much local speculation. Despite this, she had mostly kept to herself, her rare trips to the town's main street a source of fascination for the locals. Who was she? Why had she chosen Cedar Hollow? Answers would never come. On the morning of October 13th, Cedar Hollow awoke to the blaring sirens of patrol cars piercing the early morning mist. The body, discovered by a local park ranger during his routine rounds, was immediately pronounced a homicide. The details revealed later would send shockwaves through the town. Melissa had been found naked among the twisted roots of ancient trees, her body bruised and battered. Yet no obvious signs of robbery or forced entry were discovered. The remnants of her life, a designer handbag, several priceless rings, and her car parked neatly outside her cabin, remained untouched, heightening the chilling suspicion that this crime wasn't about greed, but something far deeper and darker. "It just doesn't make sense," muttered Kevin Marsh, owner of O'Malley's Diner, during an impromptu town meeting later that afternoon. "Things like this don't happen here. Cedar Hollow ain't Chicago or LA. We don't even get petty thefts, let alone this." His voice broke. Around him, others nodded in muted agreement. Many of them had lived in the town their entire lives and couldn't recall a single incident that came even close to this level of violence. Sheriff Ron Bishop, a silver-haired man with lines on his face etched by years of experience in law enforcement, stood in front of the crowd gathered in the hall of Cedar Hollow's modest church. He raised his hands to signal for silence. "Now listen up, folks," he began solemnly, glancing over the worried faces of the townsfolk. "The Montana State Police are assisting us, and we're working tirelessly to get to the bottom of this. But I'll say this, whoever did this knew what they were doing. Melissa Carter didn't just stumble into those woods. This wasn't random." The room erupted into hushed whispers. Who could have committed such an atrocity? Most townspeople ruled out the idea that a stranger had ventured that deep into Cedar Hollow and left without being noticed. Everyone knew that outsiders stuck out like sore thumbs around these parts, mainly because everyone in the town knew each other's habits, vehicles, and even pets. So naturally, a more sinister theory began to take root. Perhaps the killer wasn't an outsider at all. Perhaps they were already among them. From that day forward, a shadow fell over Cedar Hollow, lingering like a heavy fog. Parents no longer let their children roam freely through the meadows or bike along Main Street. Neighbors, once affectionate and trusting, began locking their doors and casting suspicious glances at each other. Barbecues and community gatherings were canceled as the friendly atmosphere of the town was replaced by paranoia and unease. Despite multiple press conferences and reassurances from the sheriff's office, no arrest was made in those initial weeks. The small police force, unused to dealing with crimes of this magnitude, struggled to make headway. There were no clear signs of a break-in at Melissa Carter's home. Security footage from nearby properties yielded nothing, and while the autopsy confirmed foul play, bruising consistent with a struggle and ligature marks around her wrists, the lack of fingerprints or DNA on her body left investigators grasping at straws. Speculation among Cedar Hollow's residents ran rampant. "Maybe she brought this upon herself," some whispered, recalling the rumors that had swirled about Melissa's messy divorce and enormous settlement from her ex-husband. Others were convinced that the perpetrator must have been a wandering hiker or drifter, even though, as they all admitted, it felt improbable given how insular and isolated their little community was. A few went even darker in their guesses. Could it have been jealousy, revenge, or perhaps an act of obsession gone wrong? For weeks, the quiet town was anything but quiet. Reporters arrived from state and local outlets, desperate to turn the case into a headline-grabbing tragedy, while a few true crime enthusiasts made the trek to Cedar Hollow, hoping to uncover the story behind the mystery. Meanwhile, Sheriff Bishop worked overtime, interviewing Melissa's family, combing through her financial history, and interrogating everyone in town with even a remote connection to the victim. While the rest of the country saw Cedar Hollow as just another forgotten town, to its residents, this case was deeply personal. The murder of Melissa Carter wasn't just a crime, it was the violation of everything the town stood for, the end of their cherished way of life. And if we don't solve it, Sheriff Bishop muttered under his breath one late evening, staring at photos of Melissa pinned to a corkboard in his cluttered office, this town may never heal. The mysterious crime scene. The crime scene was nothing short of chilling. Tucked away deep within a grove of towering pine trees, the spot where Melissa Carter's body was found felt both eerily serene and deeply disturbing. A thick blanket of mist clung to the ground that October morning as the sun struggled to break through the canopy overhead, casting long, shifting shadows across the forest floor. It was a local park ranger, Ben Johnson, who stumbled upon the scene during his routine patrol. What should have been another uneventful morning turned into a nightmare etched into his memory forever. "I almost walked right by her," Ben later recalled, his hands trembling as he narrated the moment to investigators. "At first, I thought it was just some trash someone left behind, but as I got closer..." His voice trailed off, and his eyes darted to the floor, as if looking any of the officers in the eye would bring the horror flooding back. "I realized it wasn't trash, it was her." Melissa's body was partially hidden amidst knotted tree roots, her pale skin stark against the dark earth and array of fallen leaves. She was completely unclothed, her arms unnaturally twisted as though she had been dragged to the location by sheer force. Her face, while bruised, held an almost haunting calm, as if frozen in a single moment of terror. She had ligature marks around her wrists, faint but undeniable, and her bare feet were caked in mud, merging with fragmented footprints leading from the nearby trail but fading as they approached the clearing. The initial inspection yielded more questions than answers. For one, nothing of monetary value seemed to have been taken. Melissa's cabin, a modern architectural marvel not far from the scene, was combed for evidence. Inside, investigators found her designer handbags, a prominently displayed collection of diamond jewelry, and her luxury SUV parked in the gravel driveway, untouched. The house itself showed no signs of a break-in. Even the front door, modern and reinforced with a security system, was locked from the inside. Detective Linda Martinez of the Montana State Police gave a televised statement to the gathered press later that day. "We are investigating all possible motives," she stated matter-of-factly, though the tension in her voice betrayed her unease. "At this time, we do not believe this was a robbery or a random act." Back at the scene, forensics teams encountered peculiarities that immediately struck them. Melissa's body bore evidence of a violent struggle. Deep bruises along her ribs and thighs hinted at a desperate attempt to escape. Yet there were no visible scratches on her hands that would indicate she had fought back with her nails. This left one theory: she had been bound, restrained too tightly to claw her way out of danger. "Her feet," one forensic officer muttered, squatting near the victim with a flashlight as his colleague jotted notes. "Look at the way the dirt clings to her soles. It's compacted more heavily on the heel than the toes. She had to have been running before she was dragged here." Still, none of it seemed to add up. If she was running, why didn't anyone hear her yell for help? Why wasn't there a trail of broken branches, scrapes, or blood leading to the crime scene as one might expect? And if she was bound, how had she managed to make it that far into the woods without help? Adding to the eerie nature of the discovery was an inexplicable detail near her body. Arranged in what could only be described as intentional positioning were several broken twigs forming a crude circular shape. Around them, piles of freshly snapped branches seemed almost ritualistic, as though meant to confuse or perhaps send a sinister message. But to whom? Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew about Melissa Carter, or thought they did. But this didn't appear to be a random act of violence. It felt calculated. "Amateur homicide," Sheriff Ron Bishop muttered under his breath as he surveyed the scene. His flashlight hovered over the odd twig arrangement for a beat too long. Or someone trying to make it look like an amateur. It didn't help that the scene seemed almost staged. Later, While poring over photographs of the site, Detective Martinez tapped a fingernail against the table's metal edge rhythmically, lost in thought. A decoy, she mused aloud. Whoever this was wanted to throw us off. Maybe they hoped we'd waste our time focusing on these branches instead of something more critical. Although foul play was evident, one unsettling aspect of the investigation was that there appeared to be no discernible motivation behind the killer's actions. If it weren't money, then what? The very fact that Melissa's expensive belongings had been left undisturbed only deepened the mystery. The assailant wasn't there for material possessions, that was for certain. "The lineup of clues, it's too clean," commented forensics analyst Nick Campbell while reviewing the crime scene photos back at the station. "No hair, no foreign fingerprints, nothing left behind but a few partial boot prints in the mud. Either this is beginner's luck, or we're dealing with someone who's done their homework." Even more unsettling was the path leading to the site where Melissa's body had been found. The tracks abruptly vanished some 30 feet from where she lay. "It's like they just disappeared into thin air," one of the rookie officers said quietly, his voice uncertain. In truth, while the detectives on the case were hunting monsters in the darkness of probability, no one, the seasoned veterans nor the green recruits, could shake the feeling that Cedar Hollow, for all its peaceful charm, was now ground zero for something sinister. Suspicion within the town escalated as residents became hypervigilant, eyes hidden behind drawn curtains and backs stiffened when passing neighbors. "It's not about why it happened anymore," Sheriff Bishop said grimly during a late-night debrief with his department. "It's about made it happen, and that's what keeps me up at night. A stranger we can track down, but if it were one of us..." His voice trailed off, the weight of that implication hanging coldly in the air. The forest, though beautiful, had always held an air of quiet menace. It was the kind of place where whispers carried farther than voices, and where the crunch of a distant branch could make your heart skip a beat. And now, standing before Melissa Carter's final resting place, no one could deny that the woods weren't just Cedar Hollow's quiet sanctuary anymore. They had become Cedar Hollow's darkest secret. One of the forensics officers held up a bagged piece of evidence, several broken fingernails stained with faint traces of blood. "Her last chance to fight back," he murmured. "Whoever they are, they didn't make this clean." But in Cedar Hollow, the real question wasn't just it was. Melissa Carter, the woman of many secrets. Melissa Carter was as much a mystery to the people of Cedar Hollow as the murder that would eventually claim her life. By all accounts, she was a woman of stark contrasts, strikingly beautiful yet distant, fabulously wealthy yet unassuming, refined yet mysteriously reserved. She was a Manhattan socialite by birth and upbringing, a figure who once graced the halls of elite New York City galas and exclusive charity events. But the version of Melissa who drove her sleek SUV into Cedar Hollow a year before her untimely death was someone entirely different. A shadow of her former self, cloaked in intrigue, with fragments of her past scattered like clues to a puzzle no one dared solve. To the townsfolk, Melissa's arrival had been as unexpected as it was intriguing. Settling into a sprawling modern wood and glass cabin perched at the edge of the local forest, she seemed almost alien amidst Cedar Hollow's humble charm. Her house, with its sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling glass windows, loomed like an abstract painting against the rustic farmhouses and charming log homes dotting the landscape. "She didn't exactly fit the mold here," commented Joanne Lively, the owner of the local general store. "I mean, don't get me wrong, she was polite, a real sweetheart sometimes, but there was this air about her, like she was just passing through, even though she bought that giant house. You don't buy a place like that if you're not planning to stay." Rumors about Melissa started the day she unlocked her front door. Why would a woman like her, whose name appeared in countless tabloid articles documenting her messy, high-profile Manhattan divorce, move to a town as remote and quiet as Cedar Hollow? Sure, Montana was no stranger to outsiders looking for solitude or a fresh start, but Melissa's retreat seemed almost conspicuously intentional. She wasn't there to reintegrate into small-town life or launch a new chapter. Instead, she flitted in and out of town sparingly, her rare appearances on Main Street leaving a trail of whispers behind. "She'd come into the diner and order a coffee, just black," Kevin Marsh, the owner of O'Malley's Diner, remarked. "Didn't talk much, kept her sunglasses on even if it was cloudy. She always brought a book, but you could tell she was barely reading it. She'd sit there sipping her coffee, just watching. Not the people, though. Not really. It was like she was watching for something else. Like she was waiting. Waiting for what exactly? That became the question Cedar Hollow couldn't stop asking. The only snippets of Melissa's life that found their way into the public eye came from the tabloids, though even then it was hard to separate fact from fiction. For years, she had been married to Derek Chapman, a hedge fund tycoon known for his aggressive business tactics and infamous temper. Their union had been a constant source of media fodder: lavish vacations to Saint-Tropez, star-studded dinners on Manhattan's Upper East Side, and of course, the implosion everyone saw coming. When the dust settled, Melissa walked away with tens of millions of dollars in settlement money, a handful of Manhattan properties, and, according to some rumors, far more than her fair share of Derek's enemies. She was smart, said Detective Linda Martinez, reflecting on Melissa's divorce during a briefing. She walked away with more than enough to set herself up for life, but people like Derek Chapman don't forget. A woman like her makes a name for herself in those circles. She either made friends or made enemies, sometimes both. But what drew her to Cedar Hollow of all places? It wasn't her childhood home. She grew up in Connecticut, attended private schools, and rarely left the tri-state area until her mid-30s. It also wasn't for work. Since her divorce, Melissa hadn't been affiliated with any major ventures. Contrary to her glamorous past, she appeared content, or at least determined, to live quietly on the edge of nowhere. Yet even in her reclusive state, Cedar Hollow couldn't help but notice the strange dualities in her existence. Melissa's presence was enigmatic. She projected elegance wherever she went, whether it was in her well-tailored sweaters and riding boots or the way she politely interacted with the townsfolk. "I remember she stopped by to pick up Thanksgiving pie one time," Joanne Lively added. She smiled, said a few words like, "Lovely weather we're having," and left. I don't know why, but it felt rehearsed, like she was trying to blend in but didn't quite know how. As much as Melissa tried to keep a low profile, her wealth sent ripples through the tight-knit community. She transformed part of her garden into an elaborate outdoor meditation space complete with stone pathways and ornamental statues. Locals even spotted delivery trucks coming up the winding roads to her cabin regularly, sometimes with packages too large to understand. "Had to be furniture or something," said Dale Emerson, the local postman. "She'd smile at me and say the same thing every time. 'Thank you, Dale, have a wonderful day.' Real friendly on the surface, but distant, like she didn't really want you to get too close." Melissa wasn't entirely antisocial, but her attempts to befriend people rarely went deeper than polite exchanges. Her interactions left the impression of a woman who was trying to stay invisible yet couldn't help but draw attention whenever she appeared. Hair that seemed effortlessly styled, expensive sunglasses, and a faint hint of a perfume you instinctively knew wasn't sold at the local pharmacy. The details were too deliberate, too calculated. And then there was the whisper of a man. John Wilkes, a local contractor, was perhaps one of the only people who ever spent extended time with Melissa. He worked on building her deck the summer before her death, and sparking some not-so-quiet speculation about their relationship. "She'd sit out there while I worked," John admitted when questioned by police. "Sometimes she'd bring me lemonade, talk about the view, real casual stuff. But she'd ask questions too. 'Ever see strangers wander into town? Anyone ever bother you when you're up here?' It didn't make sense to me back then. Neither did the locks she had me install on every door and window. Extra heavy duty. I wanted to ask why, but you could tell she wasn't the type of person to let you in if she didn't want to." Although Melissa Carter's life in Cedar Hollow seemed outwardly serene, her enigmatic aura was undeniable, and behind her composed exterior it was clear, she had demons of her own. Whatever secrets she carried with her from Manhattan, they followed her even to the quiet solace of Montana. But as the town sheriff would soon learn, there was no hiding from a past like hers. Community reactions. The discovery of Melissa Carter's body didn't just disturb the peace of Cedar Hollow, it shattered it. For a town so accustomed to tranquility, the murder felt like an earthquake, reverberating through every home, every family, and every silent street corner. It wasn't just a crime, it was a violation of trust, safety, and the deeply held belief that things like this don't happen here. Word of the murder traveled through Cedar Hollow faster than the morning sun could burn off the dense October fog. Within hours, O'Malley's Diner, the town's unofficial hub for news and gossip, was buzzing with conversation. Locals came in droves, some still in flannel pajamas, others in their barn boots and baseball caps, desperately seeking answers. Waitresses rushed to refill coffee cups as the hum of anxious voices filled the small establishment. "I swear the cops better catch whoever did this," muttered Carol Richards, a longtime resident who rarely missed her Tuesday coffee group at O'Malley's. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred her cream into her coffee. We moved here to avoid this kind of thing. It makes me sick just thinking about it." Across the room, Thomas Grady, a retired farmer known for his love of conspiracy theories, leaned in toward a group of younger men. "Y'all know what this is?" he said in a hushed tone, making sure no one outside his little circle could hear. "It's outsiders, guaranteed. Someone from the city. These folks don't respect small-town values. They come here to escape their problems, bring their mess with them." Not everyone agreed. A woman seated at the counter who had been quietly sipping her tea finally spoke up. "Thomas," she said firmly, "we don't know that. What we know is this. Someone in this town found that poor woman's body. Someone around here had to have seen or heard something. And I don't think it was a stranger." That last statement hung in the air, so heavy it seemed to silence the room for a moment. It was a thought no one wanted to entertain but couldn't entirely dismiss. What if the killer wasn't an outsider? What if they were right here, living among them? At the sheriff's office, the phones didn't stop ringing. Everyone had a theory, a suspicion, or simply needed reassurance that their family would be protected. Sheriff Ron Bishop, who had never dealt with a case of this magnitude, found himself inundated with the fears of his community. "Sheriff, do you think it's safe for my kids to walk to school? Should I be, carrying a firearm?" came one shaky voice over the phone. "Sheriff," a woman panicked in another call, "I live alone, and my neighbor swears they saw headlights coming down my driveway last night. What? What should I do?" "It's the second call like that we've gotten today, Ron," sighed Deputy Catherine Walker, hanging up one line only for another to light up. "People are scared." It wasn't just fear that spread, it was mistrust. In a town where everyone had once known each other's routines and waved at each car passing by, people started looking at their neighbors differently. The once familiar faces became strangers, cloaked in suspicion. At O'Malley's, Kevin Marsh overheard two regulars speaking in hushed tones at a back table. "You think it might be Danny?" one man whispered to the other. "I mean, he's a quiet guy, always keeping to himself up near the woods. You never know about folks like that." It wasn't long before fingers began pointing in every direction. The paranoid atmosphere began to affect everyday life. Parents herded their children home long before dusk. Barbecues and block parties were canceled. The town's Little League postponed its remaining games for the season, citing safety concerns. Even the community bingo night at the church hall, a long-standing tradition every Saturday evening, was conspicuously empty the weekend after the news broke. "Hell, we don't even our doors," said Jim McAllister, sitting on his porch while oiling his hunting rifle. "But you better believe we do now." As for local businesses, the murder created both an influx and a downturn. Joanne Lively, owner of Cedar Hollow Grocery, couldn't keep locks, extra-strength deadbolts, and pepper spray in stock. "Never thought I'd see the day when I was ordering mace for my inventory," she told a customer with a grim chuckle. Others, like Susan Langley, who managed a small bed and breakfast, weren't so lucky. Reservations dwindled to nothing by the following week, as word about Melissa's murder began to trickle into the surrounding areas. "I've had 5 people cancel this month already," Susan complained. "Guess people think we're the next big crime town. It's ridiculous." And then there were the reporters. As soon as the news hit Montana's larger cities, journalists swarmed Cedar Hollow like vultures circling a carcass. News vans clogged the small roads and camera crews set up camp near the forest trail where Melissa's body had been found. For a town that thrived on its seclusion and quiet charm, their arrival was like an intruder storming into their sanctuary. "It's a feeding frenzy," Catherine muttered to Sheriff Bishop as they watched reporters shove microphones into the faces of residents. "Like they think Cedar Hollow is some kind of sideshow." One particularly aggressive journalist tried following Sheriff Bishop back to the station. Sheriff, is it true that Melissa Carter knew her killer? Do you suspect someone in the community?" she shouted over the sound of the slamming car door. "No comment," Bishop growled, fending off another question with an irritated wave. "This investigation doesn't need any more vultures circling around it." As the town's peaceful facade began to crumble, many residents turned inward, closing themselves off from their once close-knit community. Friendly waves on the dirt roads turned into suspicious glances. Conversations at the diner turned tense, as though every patron was secretly wondering. Eventually, Cedar Hollow's mayor called for a town meeting in the local elementary school gymnasium. The turnout was larger than expected, with nearly every resident packed into the folding chairs while others stood in the back. First of all, Mayor Andrews began, raising his voice to cut through the chatter. "Let me just say that we are shaken by what has happened. But I will not stand by and see our town torn apart by fear and mistrust." Sheriff Bishop stepped forward, hands clasped tightly before him. He scanned the crowd, faces drenched in worry and despair. "I need you to listen to me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We are working around the clock on this case. The Montana State Police are assisting, and I promise you this, we're going to find who did this. But we need your cooperation and your patience." His words, though measured, weren't enough to settle the unease. One man in the back shouted, "And what are we supposed to do in the meantime, Sheriff? While waiting on answers, we're sitting ducks." The crowd noise swelled again, families demanding extra patrols, business owners demanding more information, people demanding protection from a threat no one could see. Sheriff Bishop finally raised his hands to quiet them. "Lock your doors, keep your phones close, be vigilant, but also trust your neighbors." He hesitated before continuing. "Because we need each other now more than ever." Even as the meeting adjourned, the thin veil of trust in Cedar Hollow was already in tatters. The collective paranoia lingered, stoking tensions that threatened to last far longer than the investigation itself. The spirit of Cedar Hollow, so defined by unity and camaraderie, was transformed. For the first time, the people of the town weren't just scared of what might be lurking in the woods, they were terrified of one another. Extended investigation, and the first witness. The investigation into Melissa Carter's death began as a whirlwind of activity, pulling Cedar Hollow out of its quaint complacency and dropping it squarely into a living crime drama. While Sheriff Ron Bishop and his deputies were scrambling to secure the scene and piece together what had happened, the burden of being the first witness to the grisly discovery rested heavily on the shoulders of Ben Johnson, the local park ranger, who found Melissa's body. Ben Johnson, a middle-aged man with a sun-weathered face and a quiet demeanor, had been patrolling these woods for nearly 20 years. He knew every trail, tree, and wildlife pattern better than anyone in the county. But nothing in those 2 decades had prepared him for that morning. It was around 6 a.m. when Ben started his rounds, the dawn breaking weakly through a thick fog that hung low over the forest floor. His job was mostly routine, checking for signs of illegal hunting, making sure the trails were clear. That morning, however, something felt different. The silence that usually comforted him instead pressed against his chest like a heavy weight. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. "I noticed right away that something wasn't right," Ben told Detective Linda Martinez during their first interview. His hands gripped the brim of his ranger hat as he spoke, his knuckles almost white. "It was just too still. Usually you hear rustling, squirrels running around, birds chirping, but that morning it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath." Ben had taken the narrow eastern trail, one he often walked to reach a remote grove of pine trees. About halfway into the trail, near a slight clearing, he spotted what he initially thought was a pile of discarded trash, a common enough nuisance in the woods. He approached with his flashlight, annoyed at the prospect of having to haul someone else's garbage out. But as the beam swept over the tangled roots of an old tree, his breath caught in his throat. "I almost walked right past her," Ben recalled, his voice trembling. "At first I thought it was just, I don't know, maybe a tarp or a bundle of rags. But then I saw the outline, the shape, and I knew it wasn't trash. What he was looking at wasn't garbage, it was a body." Melissa Carter's lifeless form lay twisted among the exposed roots of the tree, her pale skin contrasting starkly with the dark, damp earth around her. Panicking, Ben called the sheriff's office immediately. His voice, usually calm and steady, cracked over the radio as he described what he was seeing. "We have a serious problem out here," Ben said. "It's a woman, she's dead, and it doesn't look like an accident." Within minutes the area was buzzing with activity. Sheriff Bishop and Deputy Catherine Walker arrived first, followed by a forensics team dispatched from Helena. Yellow tape marked off the perimeter as technicians photographed every inch of the crime scene. Ben, meanwhile, sat on the tailgate of his truck, sipping from a thermos of coffee he had forgotten to sweeten, his hands still trembling. Detective Martinez arrived shortly after, her professional demeanor masking the unease she felt as she surveyed the scene. She made a beeline for Ben, wanting to hear his account firsthand before the memory could fade, or worse, distort under the weight of trauma. "Walk me through it again," Martinez said, notepad in hand, her voice calm but probing. "What did you see, hear? Anything unusual before you found her?" Ben ran a hand over his face as though wiping away the image burned into his mind. "Not much. The fog was heavier than usual, but nothing seemed off until I got closer to the clearing. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. I mean, no birds, no rustling, nothing. It's hard to explain, but the forest just felt wrong." Martinez nodded, jotting notes quickly. And you didn't see or hear anyone else? No cars, voices, nothing? He shook his head. No, the trailhead was empty when I got there, and I didn't pass a single person on my way in. But, he paused, frowning. But what? Martinez pressed, leaning slightly forward. There was this sound, he said slowly, as if he were trying to piece it together himself. Right before I saw her. It was faint, like a branch snapping in the distance. Maybe an animal, but I don't know, something about it didn't feel natural. The initial investigation of the scene uncovered unsettling details. Melissa's body showed clear signs of a struggle, ligature marks on her wrists, deep bruises on her torso, but no scratches on her hands. Bound, Martinez muttered to herself as she studied the forensics report later that day, too restricted to fight back. Her clothing was missing, but oddly enough, personal items of value, rings, a designer bracelet, and a gold chain, were found intact near the scene. This wasn't a robbery, Sheriff Bishop stated firmly during a briefing later that day. Whoever did this wanted something else or someone else. Even more troubling were the partial footprints found a few feet away from Melissa's body. At first glance they appeared to belong to a pair of heavy laced boots. However, the prints stopped abruptly as though the wearer had simply vanished into thin air. No drag marks, no continuation deeper into the woods. It left the investigators scratching their heads. And then there was the chilled fog. As Martinez walked the site with forensics, she noticed an odd detail. Every branch, every rock seemed damp, almost wet. She couldn't shake the feeling that the murderer had deliberately chosen this spot not just for privacy, but for its eerie, haunting atmosphere. Back in the town, Ben's role in discovering the body turned him into an unwilling figure of attention. People stopped him on the street, offering condolences or fishing for details. "You doing okay, Ben?" Joanne Lively, the general store owner, asked as he picked up supplies one morning. "I heard you're the one who found her. That must have been horrible." "It's not something I'll forget anytime soon," Ben replied, noticeably avoiding eye contact. Even his usual routine of stopping by O'Malley's diner for breakfast felt too overwhelming. He couldn't stomach the probing glances and muttered speculations over coffee and eggs. The weight of being the first responder, of seeing Melissa's lifeless face before anyone else, was etched into Ben's every movement. His previously unfaltering connection to the woods, his sanctuary, his livelihood, was now tainted by what he had stumbled upon. "I'm just trying to move past it," Ben told Sheriff Bishop during a brief talk outside the station. Bishop nodded knowingly, clapping him on the shoulder. "Thing like this, you never really get past it, Ben," Bishop said, his voice quiet. "You just learn to carry it." The questions surrounding Melissa's murder and Ben's discovery stretched on. Who had killed her? Why had they left her there in that precise spot? And most importantly, had Ben, unknowingly, walked into the aftermath of a killer still lurking in the woods? One thing was certain. In Cedar Hollow, the fear of the unknown was beginning to outgrow even the shadow of the crime itself. Melissa's dark past revealed. It started as whispers. Unconfirmed murmurs passed between FBI agents, state police, and investigators pulling late nights in the Cedar Hollow Sheriff's Office. By the time the full picture began to emerge, Melissa Carter's life didn't just look complex. It resembled something pulled from the pages of a noir thriller. Melissa Carter, the woman the Cedar Hollow community knew as reserved, mysterious, wealthy, and distant, had been anything but. To those who once moved in her orbit in Manhattan high society, Melissa was a lightning rod, polarizing, outspoken, and ruthlessly cunning. The deeper detectives dug into her past, the more they realized Melissa Carter wasn't just escaping a failed marriage. She had a history weighed down by secrets that made her either the accidental victim of tragedy or a target waiting to happen. The financial fallout. One of the first details to emerge was Melissa's divorce from financial magnate Derek Chapman, a hedge fund manager with a notorious reputation for both brilliance and bullying. The media frenzy that surrounded their separation had been theatrical, with tabloid headlines splashing phrases like "Carter's Gold Rush" and "Socialite crashes Wall Street King." At the center of their divorce was a bitter financial war. Melissa had secured nearly $40 million in one of the most contentious settlements in Manhattan courts that year. Friends and detractors alike accused Melissa of using her guile and social connections to leverage the fortune she walked away with. "She's no angel," one anonymous acquaintance told reporters at the time. "Melissa might look soft and delicate, but don't let that fool you. She's a shark, and she knows how to play her cards." Derek Chapman was not the kind of man to take such a loss quietly. Investigators learned that following the divorce he'd made several offhand remarks to friends about his lack of closure regarding Melissa. "Some people let things go," Derek allegedly said at a private fundraising dinner 6 months after the settlement. "Not me. I make sure debts are paid one way or the other." While it would have been easy to look at Derek as a potential suspect in his ex-wife's murder, things weren't so straightforward. Derek, for better or worse, had not been in Montana, or even the United States, at the time of Melissa's death. His alibi was airtight. He'd been on a yacht in the Mediterranean with several business partners, a fact corroborated by photos, timestamps, and witness statements. But what about Derek's associates? Melissa hadn't just walked away with money from the settlement. She'd extracted detailed knowledge about the way he did business. During the proceedings, Melissa claimed to have documents that could ruin Derek if they ever became public. Whether those documents actually existed remained a mystery, but the possibility that anyone tied to Derek might have wanted Melissa silenced gave detectives reason to dig deeper. The family rift. To many in Cedar Hollow, Melissa was simply a woman who moved to a small town to live quietly after her divorce. But the people who had known her as a child painted a very different picture. Melissa Jane Carter was born into privilege. Raised in Connecticut, with summers spent on Nantucket and winters in Aspen, she was the daughter of a self-made real estate developer, Samuel Carter, and his second wife, Claudia. But while the Carter family projected an image of affluence and unity, cracks beneath the surface splintered into full-blown rifts by the time Melissa reached her 20s. A particularly toxic point of contention was her half-sister Alice, the product of Samuel Carter's marriage to his first wife. The two women were estranged, Alice refusing to even attend Samuel's funeral years before Melissa arrived in Cedar Hollow. When questioned by detectives, Alice revealed a family history that suggested Melissa wasn't an innocent victim of her circumstances. "Melissa always knew how to manipulate, you might say," Alice said, her voice dripping with thinly veiled anger. "She wasn't the golden child everyone thought she was. When our father died, Melissa ensured that every penny of his estate ended up in her name. I filed an appeal for my rightful share, of course, but Melissa had already outmaneuvered everyone." Detectives reviewed court records to substantiate Alice's claim. Sure enough, legal documents outlined a contentious inheritance dispute between the two sisters. Though Alice retained legal counsel, Melissa had argued that their late father had privately entrusted his wealth to her just months before his death. The judge had ruled in Melissa's favor, leaving Alice practically penniless compared to her younger sister's fortune. "She wasn't ruthless, she was calculating," Alice added in an interview. "She knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. That's why she never stuck around long enough for people to figure her out." But Alice also revealed something more troubling. The late Samuel Carter may have been involved in illegal real estate deals. While the details remained murky, it seemed that Melissa not only inherited wealth but the ghosts of her father's unresolved scandals, something that could have put her on the radar of some dangerous individuals. Dangerous ties and persistent rumors. Beyond family drama and divorce scandals, Melissa's past also held darker rumors. Rumors that hinted at connections even law enforcement found hard to trace. Old acquaintances hinted that Melissa had been romantically linked to men beyond her ex-husband, several of whom were known to operate in precarious financial dealings themselves. "She clearly had a thing for power," said one anonymous source who attended New York society gatherings with Melissa. "Her relationships always seemed strategic, like she was planning her next move. And people like that tend to step on toes. Dangerous toes." Then there was the incident involving a private lawsuit filed against Melissa during her time in Manhattan. While the records were sealed, an insider confirmed that Melissa had faced allegations regarding improper use of insider information. Though the case was mysteriously dismissed, one detective mused that it was easy to imagine Melissa had made enemies, not just in high society but perhaps even within organized circles. "This is the thing about people like Melissa Carter," Detective Martinez muttered during a late-night session, studying a timeline of Melissa's activities. "They leave a trail. Every deal, every personal choice, every person they alienate, it adds up somewhere. It just takes the right or the wrong person deciding she was worth silencing." A life built on secrets? As their knowledge of Melissa grew, both locally and from her past, investigators were forced to question if Melissa Carter had been running from her own history, escaping her enemies, her reputation, her choices. Whether those unseen ghosts from her past found her in Cedar Hollow, or something far simpler precipitated her violent death, remained a question Detective Martinez privately wrestled with. "Maybe she just couldn't outrun it," Sheriff Bishop concluded after sifting through endless reports. When you live a life built on secrets and betrayal, it's not a question of if something will catch up to you. It's when. What had started as the murder of a wealthy recluse in a sleepy Montana town was rapidly unfolding into a web of vendettas, rivals, and long-buried grudges. But one thing was clear. Melissa Carter's past might have been filled with shadows, but someone out there held the knife that finally ended her story. Allegations from family Melissa Carter's tragic death not only uncovered a pattern of secrets within Cedar Hollow, but also caused old family skeletons to rattle violently in their closets. As investigators dug deeper into her life, one name kept coming up. Alice Carter, Melissa's older half-sister. Their relationship, as it turned out, had been a battlefield for years, a scalding rivalry masked by the superficial grace of their upper-class upbringing. Alice Carter lived far from the tranquility of Montana, residing in a modest suburban neighborhood in Connecticut, a stark contrast to the sprawling wealth she had once expected to inherit. She had long been estranged from Melissa, and when detectives reached out to interview her, old grievances quickly spilled to the surface. Melissa was no saint, Alice told Detective Linda Martinez during a video call interview. Her tone was sharp, her words dripping with contempt. People always saw her as this sophisticated, polished, beautiful woman who had it all, but if you ask me, Melissa only ever cared about herself. Alice had very little patience for formalities. She dove straight into the heart of her bitterness, the contentious inheritance battle that had destroyed whatever sisterly bond the two might have once had. Their father, Samuel Carter, had built his fortune as a real estate developer, amassing a sprawling empire from his cold, calculated knack for deal-making. But when he died suddenly of a heart attack, the family was left reeling and divided. Dad always favored Melissa, Alice said bitterly, folding her arms across her chest. She had this way of wrapping him around her little finger. I used to think it was just because she was the baby of the family, but it was more than that. It was manipulation, pure and simple. The inheritance dispute. After Samuel Carter's passing, his estate became the focus of a drawn-out and explosive legal battle between the sisters. According to Alice, the will was initially straightforward. The estate would be divided nearly equally between them, with a small sum set aside for charity. But just weeks before his sudden death, Samuel reportedly amended the will, leaving the vast majority of his fortune, including multiple properties and business assets, solely to Melissa. Alice contested the amendment, accusing her younger sister of coercing their ailing father into making the change. But when the case went to court, Melissa presented a series of signed affidavits from Samuel's personal attorney, business partners, and even his physician, all stating that the change had been made willingly and without pressure. Alice, unable to produce evidence to the contrary, ultimately lost the case and was left with nothing more than a modest trust fund. "She planned the whole thing!" Alice snarled during the interview, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and frustration. "She knew Dad wasn't in his right mind during his last few months, but she made sure no one could ever prove it. I tried to fight it, I really did, but Melissa, she was always 2 steps ahead." Alice admitted that losing the inheritance wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle, the injustice of watching her sister manipulate their father to secure a fortune that should have been shared. She didn't need all of it, Alice added bitterly, her lips curling into a grimace. She already had everything, looks, charm, wealth from her marriage, and still, she took it all. A Broken Family investigators found that the inheritance dispute was just one piece of the dysfunctional dynamic between Alice and Melissa. Their childhood, though cloaked in privilege, had been far from idyllic. Samuel Carter was a man of strong opinions and cold affection, the kind of father who expected his daughters to excel, yet rarely showed warmth. Growing up under his shadow had sown resentment between the sisters, as both vied for his attention in different ways. Melissa loved playing the favorite, Alice recalled bitterly. She'd come home with some perfect test score or stand next to Dad during his business galas, smiling and looking like the perfect little heiress. Meanwhile, I was the screw-up, the one who couldn't live up to his expectations. But family dysfunction reached new heights when Claudia, Melissa's mother, revealed a shocking detail during her own interview with detectives. According to Claudia, Samuel Carter had been hiding a history of shady business deals, including allegations of bribery and illegal land acquisitions. Claudia claimed that Samuel often confided in Melissa, grooming her to understand the more sinister side of his business empire. "That wasn't a father-daughter relationship," Claudia told detectives with a resigned sigh. That was a mentor grooming his protege. He taught her to be ruthless, to see people as opportunities or obstacles, and Melissa, she learned well. The knowledge of Samuel's unethical dealings put Melissa in a difficult position after his death. She inherited not just his wealth but also the ghosts of his unfinished business. Investigators began to wonder if these ghosts, or the rivals they created, had finally caught up to her. Did sibling resentment turn dark? When detectives pressed Alice on her feelings about Melissa's death, her reaction was both candid and nuanced. "Am I sad she's gone?" Alice asked, raising a skeptical eyebrow. "I don't know, maybe. It feels wrong to say no, but it's not like we were close. Honestly, sometimes I think the world's a little safer without someone like her running around." The comment was jarring, even to someone as seasoned as Detective Martinez. "Do you mean that figuratively, or are you suggesting something more direct?" she asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. Alice scoffed. "What do you think, Detective? I mean, she was dangerous in the way people with too much power and no conscience are dangerous. That doesn't mean I wanted her dead." Despite her bitterness, Alice provided the detectives with one clue they couldn't ignore. She claimed that Melissa had once confided in a mutual family friend about receiving threats shortly after winning the inheritance case. "She never told me who," Alice admitted, "but she said something about someone trying to fix what wasn't theirs. At the time I thought it was just more drama. Melissa loved being the center of attention after all, but looking back," her voice trailed off and she shrugged. "Maybe she wasn't making it up." A family of motives. As investigators pieced together the shattered dynamics of Melissa's family, a troubling picture began to emerge. There wasn't just one person with a reason to resent Melissa, there were several. Alice's unresolved anger over losing the inheritance was just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond her, there were Samuel Carter's old associates, some of whom might have seen Melissa's inheritance as a threat to their own dealings. Claudia, though publicly mourning her daughter, appeared guarded and unusually reluctant to answer deeper questions about Melissa's life. And Melissa herself, masterful at keeping secrets, had taken many to her grave. Detective Martinez summarized it best after reviewing the interviews. "This family doesn't just have skeletons in the closet," she told Sheriff Bishop. "They've got an entire graveyard." One by one, investigators began to trace the fractures in the Carter family, and wondered just how many of them might lead to a killer. A murder with signs of assault? The case of Melissa Carter grew darker as investigators uncovered unsettling physical evidence at the crime scene and during the autopsy. From the outset, the position of her body and the surrounding environment suggested violence, but specifics were slow to emerge. Every clue, from the ligature marks on her wrists to the bruises along her torso, painted a hauntingly vivid picture of her final moments. Yet one question loomed heavily over the investigation. Was this murder also a sexual assault? The possibility of such a crime sent shockwaves through Cedar Hollow. Small towns like Cedar Hollow rarely saw violent crimes, let alone acts so intimate and heinous. But as the forensic team began its painstaking work, some crucial details appeared to challenge the early assumptions of assault. The autopsy report. Melissa Carter's autopsy was conducted by Dr. Pauline Hayward, the county's lead medical examiner based in nearby Helena. A veteran in her field with a reputation for meticulousness, Hayward's findings were critical to understanding both the nature and motive behind the crime. "Her body tells a story," Hayward said in a press briefing with Sheriff Bishop just days after the autopsy. "The question now is how well we can interpret that story." The physical examination revealed that Melissa had likely suffered a violent altercation relatively close to her time of death. Deep bruising along her arms and thighs revealed the extent of the struggle, evidence that she had fought to escape. Ligature marks around her wrists and faint abrasions on her ankles suggested she had been restrained, but the bindings had been removed or taken by the killer. Her cause of death was officially listed as blunt force trauma to the head, likely the result of being struck with a heavy object near the clearing where her body was found. But when it came to potential sexual assault, the findings were both inconclusive and unusual. Despite the initial impressions at the scene, her body found unclothed in an apparent state of vulnerability, Dr. Hayward found no definitive evidence of penetration or physical signs commonly linked to sexual assault. The absence of traditional markers, however, didn't eliminate the possibility. "There are bruises and scratches along her inner thighs," Hayward explained to law enforcement officials during a closed-door debriefing. "It's inconsistent. There are no clear indicators of assault, but there's enough here to suggest she may have been targeted for a purpose beyond simple homicide." The medical examiner also noted the distinct lack of DNA evidence. Swabs taken from Melissa's body showed no presence of foreign fluids or trace evidence that could easily tie a perpetrator to her. This lack of evidence left a gaping hole in the investigation, frustrating both the local sheriff's office and the Montana State Police. Whoever was responsible for this left very little behind, Detective Linda Martinez stated grimly. It's either beginner's luck, or we're dealing with someone who was careful enough to avoid leaving DNA, a chilling level of control for such a violent act. A masterful staged scene? The removal of Melissa's clothing and the positioning of her body added another troubling layer to the investigation. Was her murder staged to look like a sexual assault in order to mask the true motive? Or was the act more sinister, meant to humiliate or degrade her even after death? Across the investigative team, theories began to form. Forensic analyst Nick Campbell suggested that the lack of DNA was as meaningful as the absence of evidence of penetration. "It's almost too clean," Campbell remarked during a late-night strategy meeting. "If she was restrained, as we're seeing with those ligature marks, why was the scene so orderly? We're either missing something big or the person responsible wanted it to look this way." Sheriff Bishop wasn't convinced. "Too clean or not," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you don't leave someone like that unless you want to send a message. Her being nude at the scene wasn't an accident. But what kind of message? And to whom?" The questions became the focal point of investigative discussions for weeks as the potential for deeper, more psychological motives came into play. The psychological undertones. To better understand the implications of the crime scene, the Cedar Hollow Task Force enlisted the help of criminal profiler Dr. Serena Levine, an expert who had worked extensively on staging crimes and crimes with embedded symbolism. Dr. Levine carefully reviewed the crime scene photos and Melissa's autopsy report, providing critical insights. "Crimes of this nature often have a dual purpose," Dr. Levine explained. "You have the obvious violence and the intent to kill, but then you have the secondary layer, the calculated removal of power from the victim." She continued, "Removing the victim's clothing and leaving her in such a natural, vulnerable setting could be viewed as symbolic domination, or an attempt to reduce her to a state of helplessness. It's not just murder, it's personal." While sexual assault couldn't be ruled out, Dr. Levine cautioned the investigators not to focus too narrowly on that angle. "This could simply be staging," she said. "The killer may want you to believe it was an act of passion or spontaneous violence when in reality, it could be as cold and calculated as they come. The more you follow the emotions of this case, the more likely you are to miss the underlying rationale." The public reacts. The revelation of both the brutal details of Melissa's death and the potential involvement of sexual staging sent Cedar Hollow into a frenzy. Rumors spread like wildfire, circulating from O'Malley's diner to the church meetings and the once-friendly neighborhood block parties. "Who does something like that?" asked Carol Richards, who now hesitated to let her teenage daughter walk alone to school. "It wasn't just a murder, it's something worse." Others couldn't resist theorizing. At O'Malley's, one local resident leaned over his coffee cup to whisper, "Someone out there has issues. You don't kill like that unless there's something deep, twisted going on in your head." The lack of a clear motive only heightened the tension in town. As Sheriff Bishop hosted press briefings, parents demanded to know whether this was the work of a predator or a more targeted act. Were their kids safe? Was there someone lurking in the woods, waiting to do it again? Bishop remained firm in his statements. "At this time, we have no evidence to suggest this was the work of a serial offender or random violence, but we urge everyone to remain vigilant. Lock your doors, talk to your family, and if you see something or hear something that raises suspicion, let us know immediately." Questions still unanswered. As weeks passed, the investigation moved forward with frustrating slowness. Without DNA evidence or definitive proof of sexual assault, the detectives found themselves on shaky ground. The psychological profile painted a chilling portrait of control and manipulation, but nothing concrete. "We may never know the exact intent," Detective Martinez admitted. "Whether it involved sexual motives or not, the killer stripped this woman of her dignity, even in death. That won't be forgotten or forgiven." For Melissa Carter, it seemed even in her final moments, the true nature of what drove her killer to act remained as enigmatic as the woman herself. Whether the crime was rooted in passion or stagecraft, Cedar Hollow was left with the haunting impression that someone out there had meticulously designed this tragedy, and might still be lurking in the shadows. An unexpected suspect, a teenager living nearby. For weeks, The investigation into Melissa Carter's murder had been a maze of dead ends, speculative theories, and mounting public pressure. But everything changed when forensic analysts uncovered an unexpected breakthrough. DNA evidence, recovered from a faint touch on one of Melissa's rings and on a twig near the crime scene, led investigators not to a seasoned criminal or an outsider, but to William Barnes, a 14-year-old boy who lived just a quarter mile from Melissa's secluded cabin. The revelation stunned the town of Cedar Hollow. The notion that a local teenager, a kid practically everyone in town had seen riding his bike or sitting in the pews at the Sunday service, could be embroiled in something so gruesome seemed almost unthinkable. But as the layers of William's behavior and background came to light, the horrifying possibility began to feel disturbingly plausible: the DNA match. The DNA breakthrough came quietly during what was otherwise another uneventful day at the sheriff's office. The forensic team from Helena had been combing over the otherwise scant amount of evidence collected from Melissa's body and the scene of the crime. There were no fingerprints, no footprints that veered to a clear suspect, no signs of forced entry at Melissa's cabin. But they'd managed to retrieve microscopic amounts of skin cells from the object Melissa had clutched in her final moments, a large ruby ring on her hand. When the confirmation of the DNA match reached the Cedar Hollow station, Detective Linda Martinez couldn't believe her eyes as she scanned the details. "William Barnes," she murmured aloud, the name catching Sheriff Ron Bishop's attention from across the room. "William Barnes?" Bishop repeated, leaning back in his chair with an incredulous look. "That's the Barnes kid, isn't it? Lives with his folks near the West End?" Martinez nodded. "Yeah, that's him, 14 years old, high school freshman." She looked at the lab report again as though expecting it to change. How the hell does someone like him end up involved in something like this? Bringing in William the Barnes home was modest, a small weathered house just beyond Cedar Hollow's forest limit. When detectives arrived to bring William in for questioning, they were greeted by his mother, a nervous but kindly woman in her late 40s who worked as a part-time clerk at the grocery store. "Is everything okay, Sheriff?" she asked, glancing nervously toward the squad car idling on the gravel driveway. Beside her, William stood in torn sneakers and a hoodie much too big for his lanky frame, looking more puzzled than frightened. Sheriff Bishop held up his hands reassuringly. "This isn't an arrest, Mrs. Barnes, but we need William to come with us to answer a few questions. It's about the Melissa Carter case. It's important." Across the threshold, Mrs. Barnes visibly paled. "Melissa Carter?" she whispered before quickly pivoting. "What could he possibly know about that? He's just a kid. He wouldn't hurt a fly." William, meanwhile, fidgeted with the strings of his hoodie, his face a mix of innocence and something unplaceable. He shrugged when his mother asked if he knew anything about Melissa or why the police were at their door. "I don't know," he mumbled. But when Sheriff Bishop looked closer, he noticed the edges of the boy's lips quiver ever so slightly. Nervousness, guilt. The lines between the two were growing hazier with every passing second. The interrogation down at the sheriff's office, the mood was tense. Detective Martinez was careful to maintain a calm tone during William's initial questioning. Technically, she and Sheriff Bishop were navigating uncharted territory. The idea of a 14-year-old being tied to a murder like this was nearly unfathomable. "How well do you know Melissa Carter?" Martinez asked, settling across from William as he stared at the table between them. "I don't know her," William muttered, his voice barely audible. "But you've seen her before?" "Yeah," he replied. "She lived down the way. Everyone knew who she was." Through careful, patient questioning, William began to give bits and pieces of his interaction with Melissa. He admitted that he had seen her jogging in the mornings and sometimes walking to town. Occasionally their paths had crossed in seemingly innocuous ways. "I helped her once," William offered after a long silence. "A few weeks back, she was walking home with groceries and I asked if she needed help carrying anything. She handed me a bag." That detail, while small, was crucial. Investigators began piecing together a picture of a boy who clearly saw Melissa as more than just a neighbor, the breaking point. After hours of gentle coaxing, William finally cracked. His hands trembled in his lap as Detective Martinez leaned forward, her tone calm but her words pointed. "William, the evidence tells us you were with Melissa," she said softly. "We've got proof you were there near her. This is your chance to tell us the truth, what really happened that night." And then it all spilled out. According to William, he had developed what he called a crush on Melissa, a fixation that he claimed grew over time. He started following her, studying her schedule, and even peering through the oversized glass windows of her modern cabin on the weekends when he was sure no one else was around. He insisted his intentions were harmless, born out of admiration, but his story soon took a darker turn. "I wanted to talk to her," he mumbled, his voice breaking. "That night I was just walking by her place and she was outside. I didn't mean to scare her, but when she saw me she freaked out." When Melissa panicked, William admitted, he tried to calm her by grabbing her arm. Whether out of fear or desperation, things escalated quickly. In his words, Melissa became frantic, pushing him away and struggling to run. "I just wanted her to stop screaming," William sobbed, his face buried in his hands. "I grabbed her and she fell. She hit her head on the ground real hard. I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear." A shocking revelation. Despite William's claim that Melissa's death was accidental, investigators couldn't ignore the nuances of his admission. The deliberate removal of her clothes, the seemingly ritualistic staging of the scene, and the bruises on her body suggested far more deliberate intentions. But William denied everything else. "That wasn't me," he insisted, his eyes wide. "I swear I didn't do anything else. She hit her head and I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I just left her." Still, the evidence didn't lie. His DNA was present, and his timeline placed him at the crime scene. Whether his actions were born out of infatuation, rage, or fear, the fact remained. William Barnes wasn't just a confused teenager. He was quickly becoming a prime suspect in Melissa Carter's murder. A community in shock. When news of William's involvement broke, Cedar Hollow erupted. How could someone so young be capable of something so brutal? Parents clutched their children a little tighter, and neighbors whispered behind closed doors. The boy who'd once waved shyly at locals as he passed by on his bike was now the most infamous figure in town. "If someone like William can do something like this," one local woman whispered at O'Malley's diner, "then we're all raising kids we don't really know." For the Barnes family, the fallout was immediate. Mrs. Barnes, once a familiar friendly face at the grocery store, closed herself off from the world. Their house, once alive with firewood chopping sounds and family lunches on the porch, grew eerily silent. And William? He was left to face the unimaginable consequences of his darkest impulses. The shocking confession. For weeks, the investigation into Melissa Carter's murder had yielded more questions than answers. The forensic evidence was puzzling, the motive elusive, and the town of Cedar Hollow was shrouded in fear. But everything began to unravel the moment William Barnes, the quiet, unassuming 14-year-old boy living just down the road from Melissa's cabin, sat in the interrogation room with Detective Linda Martinez. What began as careful questioning, an effort to piece together why William's DNA had been found at the crime scene, soon turned into one of the most unsettling confessions the Cedar Hollow Sheriff's Office had ever heard. A slow breakdown. Sitting across from Detective Martinez, William Barnes seemed smaller than his 14 years. His lanky frame was curled inward, his fingers nervously fidgeting with the strings of his oversized hoodie. He avoided eye contact, staring instead at the scratched wooden surface of the table between them. Detective Martinez studied him carefully, her approach gentle but strategic. She knew teenagers could build walls of silence, but their emotions often betrayed them if given just the right push. "William," she began softly, breaking the heavy silence, "you're not in trouble yet. We just need you to help us understand. You were near Melissa Carter the night she died. We know this." Her voice stayed calm, almost maternal. "But what we don't know is why." William's jaw tightened, his lips trembling ever so slightly. It wasn't like that," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wasn't like what?" Martinez leaned forward slightly, her pen poised over her notepad. "Tell me, help me understand." The boy's shoulders collapsed as though the weight of the world had suddenly crushed him. His hands trembled on the table. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered, his voice shaky and on the verge of breaking. Martinez kept her tone steady, resisting the urge to lean too hard. "What didn't you mean to happen, William?" she asked. "Talk to me. Let me help you." The truth begins to spill. With a deep, shuddering breath, William began to speak. The words came slowly at first, halting and fragmented, but soon the story emerged, a dark and twisted tale of obsession that had spiraled violently out of control. "I liked her," William admitted, his voice cracking under the weight of the confession. "I mean, not like everyone else liked her. She wasn't just some lady in the neighborhood to me." He hesitated, his fingers gripping the edges of his hoodie like a lifeline. "She was beautiful. Like, perfect. And she lived so close. I'd see her when she went jogging in the mornings or when she came back with groceries." His voice took on an almost bizarre wistfulness, like he was still clinging to the hope that his feelings were innocent. "I just wanted to talk to her, you know? But she was always so distant." Martinez nodded encouragingly, though a cold pit formed in her stomach. This wasn't admiration, this was fixation. And then, Martinez asked gently, coaxing him to continue, I started, paying attention to her, he confessed, the words tumbling out awkwardly. Like, what time she'd leave the house, what time she'd come back. I swear I didn't mean to be weird or anything, I just liked knowing where she was. The detective resisted the urge to glance at Sheriff Bishop, who was watching from behind the two-way mirror. William's tone wasn't just nervous, it bordered on delusion. The night everything went wrong. That night, William claimed, he hadn't set out to hurt anyone. I was walking, he said. Just walking by her place like I sometimes did. I wasn't going to do anything, I swear. But then, he spotted Melissa outside. She had been standing near the porch, her arms loaded with what looked like a bag of books, her home lit faintly by the glow from the living room behind her. She looked so pretty, William said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I thought, maybe I could talk to her just this one time, just say hi. But Melissa didn't react the way William had hoped. According to his account, when he stepped toward her in the dark, she froze. When he called her name, she panicked. She screamed, William said, his voice cracking as tears began spilling down his cheeks. I didn't mean to scare her, I just wanted her to stop screaming. When Martinez gently pushed him for more detail, William said he had tried to calm her down, grabbing her arm to hold her still. But Melissa struggled, hitting him in the chest and trying to break free. She fell, William sobbed, his hands now covering his face. I didn't push her, I swear, but she just fell backward, and there was a rock right there. It wasn't my fault. He shook his head violently as though attempting to convince himself. It wasn't my fault. The staged scene. Martinez knew there was still something missing. Melissa's injuries, the removal of her clothes, the haunting placement of the body in the woods. None of that sounded accidental, even if William's story started that way. Tell me about after she fell, Martinez said softly. You left her there, right? You ran? William shook his head slowly, tears dripping off his chin. No, he whispered. I didn't just leave. When pressed, William's voice grew almost robotic, as though he were suppressing the weight of what he was saying. I thought someone would know it was me. If they found her like that. So, what did you do? Martinez asked, though dread was already pooling in her chest. I took her to the woods, William admitted, his voice so low it was almost inaudible. I thought, maybe if no one found her for a while it wouldn't matter, like it wouldn't come back to me. What about her clothes? Martinez said, her voice steady but sharp. Why did you take those off, William? There was a long, suffocating silence. William stared down at the table. I thought... He swallowed hard. I thought if people thought it was someone older, someone creepy, then they wouldn't look at me. It was a chilling admission, one that caused Martinez to sit back in her chair, her careful facade briefly faltering. A confession that didn't add up. Despite the revelation, some things still didn't make sense. William's version of events explained part of what happened to Melissa, but the methodical staging of the body and the lack of his fingerprints on many of her belongings suggested something, or someone, else. You did all that on your own? Martinez probed, narrowing her eyes. No one helped you? William shook his head frantically. No one else was there, it was just me, I swear. But Martinez wasn't convinced. Okay, William, she said finally, sliding her notebook shut. We'll figure the rest out. A town divided. When news of William's confession broke, Cedar Hollow struggled to reconcile the sweet, awkward boy they thought they knew with the monster they couldn't avoid imagining. Parents pulled their children closer, fearful that someone so young could be capable of something so sinister. The Barnes family, once a pillar of the small-town community, quickly became pariahs. Some refused to believe William's actions were intentional. He's just a kid, Joanne Lively murmured at the diner. Kids make mistakes. But others weren't so forgiving. Mistakes? Barked a man at the counter. A mistake is spilling your soda. What happened to Melissa was evil. The questions surrounding William's confession would linger long after his arrest. Was he truly a confused, infatuated boy who panicked and crossed a line he couldn't uncross? Or was there something darker hidden beneath the surface, a side of William Barnes no one in Cedar Hollow had ever imagined? Family and society's reactions. When the news of William Barnes's involvement in Melissa Carter's murder broke, it sent shockwaves that extended far beyond Cedar Hollow's borders. What had once been a horrific mystery cloaked in uncertainty now took on an even more troubling dimension. Not only had violence shattered the peaceful, tightly knit town, but the revelation that the alleged perpetrator was a 14-year-old neighbor seemed to crumble the very foundations of their community. Almost overnight, Cedar Hollow became a town divided, both over William's culpability and the wider questions surrounding what it all meant for their children, their neighbors, and their way of life. A family in shambles. For the Barnes family, the fallout was immediate and deeply personal. The day after William's confession, the Barnes home, once a modest but lively household bustling with the sounds of family dinners, the chopping of firewood, and siblings' laughter, fell into eerie silence. Margaret Barnes, William's mother, was no longer the cheerful, approachable lady who worked as a part-time grocery store clerk and chit-chatted with customers at the checkout line. She retreated indoors, turning off her phone and drawing her curtains tight. Neighbors who used to greet her warmly now crossed the street, heads low, unsure whether to offer condolences or keep their distance. Margaret's oldest son, Christopher, who attended a college 2 states away, returned home amid the unfolding scandal to support his family. Barely able to whisper a word to reporters camped outside their home, he was pale and visibly shaken when he briefly addressed them. "Please," he begged, shielding his mother and 2 younger siblings, "we're trying to understand this ourselves." Margaret's gaze burned into the ground as she shuffled inside, holding tightly to her youngest daughter's hand. By all accounts, she was a mother destroyed. Her soft whispered statements to those she still trusted carried a haunting refrain. "How could my son do this? He was such a good boy." Meanwhile, William's father, Harold Barnes, faced the community's judgment with stoic silence. A truck driver by trade, Harold had spent much of his life on the road, returning home only intermittently during long-haul assignments. While many whispered cruelly that Harold's absenteeism may have contributed to William's behavior, others defended him, saying, "He's a hard-working man doing the best he can." Still, Harold's face betrayed the truth during the rare moments he ventured out, picking up groceries or delivering the family mail to avoid reporters. He looked hollowed out, barely able to return the gazes of old friends. When confronted by a journalist who dared ask, "Did you know your son was capable of something like this?" Harold's only response was a hoarse growl. "Did I know? What kind of father do you think I am?" The town's reaction: suspicion, shock, and blame. If the murder itself had fractured the peace of Cedar Hollow, William's confession turned those fractures into deep gulfs of distrust and suspicion. Families who had known the Barnes family for years struggled to reconcile their memories of William with the horrific details of Melissa Carter's death. Where parents had once waved at William from their porches as he biked to school or helped his mother carry groceries, they now saw only a boy who had crossed a line they couldn't imagine forgiving. The whispers in O'Malley's diner, the unofficial hub of town gossip, grew louder than the sizzle of bacon and clatter of coffee mugs. "I knew something was off about him," muttered Carol Richards to her coffee group one morning. "Quiet kids like that, you can never tell what's going on in their heads." "That's ridiculous," Joanne Lively shot back, her arms crossed defensively. "William wasn't some monster. He's just a kid. Doesn't make sense." "Well, it makes sense if you think about the way kids are these days," piped up Thomas Grady, the town's self-appointed conspiracy theorist. "They're all glued to their screens, isolating themselves. Who knows what kind of twisted stuff they're watching online?" Neighbors began seeing danger where they'd once seen familiarity. Was the Barnes family hiding more secrets? How well did anyone in Cedar Hollow truly know their neighbors, or even their own children? Schools and parents, a community on edge. The ripple effects reached beyond gossiping adults. At the small Cedar Hollow High School where William had been a freshman, the atmosphere was a mix of fear, confusion, and intrusive speculation. Students whispered in hallways or passed notes in class, their conversations tinged with the kind of morbid curiosity only teenagers could muster. "I had math with him last semester," said Claire Johnson, a sophomore at the school, to a reporter who managed to catch her leaving the building. "He didn't talk much, but he wasn't, creepy. Just quiet." Parents, on the other hand, spiraled into overprotection. Something about the crime and William's youth struck a primal chord of fear. Who could have predicted something like this? If a seemingly harmless 14-year-old boy could harbor such darkness, what about their own children? Barbecues once filled with laughter and beer gave way to quiet evenings indoors, where parents watched their kids like hawks. "I don't know anymore," said Kathy Marshall, a mother of 3. "Do I even know what my kids are up to when they're online, when they're hanging out after school?" At the community church meeting the following Sunday, Pastor Harris addressed the congregation with a sermon that was less about faith and more about human frailty. "What happened here shouldn't turn us against one another," he urged. "This boy, this tragedy didn't come out of nowhere. Maybe as a community we didn't do enough. Maybe we could have seen it, reached out." but not everyone shared his sentiment. One mother, her voice shaking with fury, stood up and challenged Pastor Harris directly. "Reached out?" she spat bitterly. "William Barnes didn't need anyone to reach out." He needed to be stopped. A media-feeding frenzy. As Cedar Hollow tried to pick up the pieces, the national media descended, turning the quiet Montana town into the next big headline across the country. News vans clogged Main Street, and reporters swarmed outside the sheriff's office, competing to get exclusive details. The story they spun was less about Melissa Carter herself, and more about the chilling narrative of a boy next door turned killer. "The boy who murdered the heiress," read one particularly sensational newspaper headline. Another tabloid declared, "Innocent suburb or monsters within, the William Barnes story." True crime enthusiasts from around the country flooded online forums, speculating on everything from William's mental state to potential conspiracies involving the Barnes family. Some in Cedar Hollow found the media intrusion unbearable. "They're treating this like it's some kind of entertainment," grumbled Kevin Marsh, the owner of O'Malley's Diner. "Melissa's dead, her family's mourning, and William's just a kid, but all they see is a story to sell." Others, however, quietly hoped that the coverage might provide answers the town couldn't find on its own. "Maybe someone out there knows something we don't," said Dale Emerson, Cedar Hollow's postman. "Something that could explain all of this." A community shattered. Once a town defined by its trust and mutual support, Cedar Hollow found itself grappling with a wound that seemed unlikely to heal. Families locked their doors early, community events were canceled, and friendly waves began to turn into hesitant glances. Fear spread like wildfire, threatening to dismantle the very relationships that had once held Cedar Hollow together. "Things like this aren't supposed to happen here," Sheriff Bishop admitted quietly to Detective Martinez one evening after yet another press conference. "And when they do, they tear everything apart." The aftermath of William's confession wasn't just about crime or punishment. It was about a town wrestling with itself, its insecurities, its blind spots, and, ultimately, its humanity. Lessons learned from the case. The shocking murder of Melissa Carter and the resulting fallout left Cedar Hollow changed forever. The quiet, picturesque town nestled amidst Montana's rugged beauty faced an unexpected reckoning, one that forced every resident, as well as those beyond its borders, to examine deeper truths about human nature, community, and the fragility of the imagined safety net people cling to. As the dust began to settle and the media circus moved on to other stories, the residents of Cedar Hollow had no choice but to reflect on the disturbing series of events that had shaken their lives, the fragility of small-town safety. For generations, Cedar Hollow had thrived on the belief that it was immune to the evils of the outside world. "Nothing bad ever happens here" was more than a cliché, it was practically gospel. Doors were left unlocked, children roamed freely, and neighbors trusted one another implicitly. But the murder of Melissa Carter turned this sense of security into an illusion. Sheriff Ron Bishop, a man who had spent most of his career handling minor disputes and traffic violations, found himself at the center of a crime that most small-town law enforcement officers fear yet rarely encounter. "I tell you," he remarked in an interview shortly after the case was closed, "the thing I keep coming back to is this. It's not that crime doesn't happen in small towns, it's that we don't think it can happen, so we miss the warning signs, we get complacent." That complacency became the town's collective regret. Parents realized how little they knew about their children's lives. Community leaders admitted they'd become comfortable with surface-level relationships, failing to dig deeper into the issues that might be brewing beneath the surface. "We thought we were untouchable," said Joanne Lively during a church meeting, her voice strained. "Now I wake up at night wondering what else we've been blind to. We built our lives on trust, but maybe we weren't paying enough attention." The complexity of adolescence. William Barnes, the 14-year-old boy at the center of the case, forced Cedar Hollow to confront the complexities of growing up in modern America. For all their attempts at understanding, many in town found it incomprehensible that a child from their own neighborhood could have committed such a heinous act. But in the months following the confession, experts and educators began to probe the deeper implications of William's story. Psychologists brought in by the Montana State Police noted that William exhibited classic signs of social isolation and emotional detachment. "He wasn't necessarily an angry or violent kid," said Dr. Marie Jensen, a child psychologist who reviewed his case. "What he suffered from was a deep sense of loneliness and fixation, which when unchecked spiraled into something dangerous." For parents in Cedar Hollow, this was perhaps the most sobering takeaway. Margaret Barnes, William's mother, admitted with raw honesty during an interview, "I wish I'd seen it sooner. He wasn't a bad child. He was quiet, yes, but I thought he was just shy. Kids don't come with warning labels, you know? You never think that's my kid. The one everyone's going to fear." Local teachers, once confident in their ability to serve as guides and mentors to their students, began questioning their roles. Were they really tuning into the emotional needs of their students? Or had they, like the rest of the town, assumed that living in a quiet community meant there was little to worry about? The role of technology. A detailed investigation into William's life revealed the outsized role technology had played in shaping his worldview. While his outward shyness gave the town little reason for alarm, William had been active online, retreating into a digital world where his fixation on Melissa Carter had been amplified by the echo chambers of social media and message boards. Detective Linda Martinez, who had spent hours combing through William's browser history, described it plainly. What he consumed online mirrored his fixation on Melissa. He wasn't just sitting alone in his room, he was being fed content that fueled his obsession. The realization sent a chill through Cedar Hollow's parents. At town meetings, conversations shifted from questions about screen time to deeper worries about content moderation and the lack of oversight in children's digital lives. "The internet's this big invisible thing we can't control," said Dale Emerson, the town's postman and father of 2 teenagers. "We thought we were protecting our kids by raising them here, but the reality is, the internet is everywhere, and it's shaping them in ways we don't even understand." Trust and vigilance in the community. In the aftermath of Melissa's murder, one of the hardest lessons Cedar Hollow had to learn was that trust, by itself, wasn't enough. For decades, the town had prided itself on being a close-knit community, where everyone watched out for one another and outsiders stood out like sore thumbs. But this tragedy proved that danger doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it's right next door. Pastor Harris, addressing the congregation one Sunday morning, grappled with this new reality. "We believed we knew one another," he said, his forehead creased with concern. "We thought that by living side by side, crossing paths every day, we were connected, but maybe we mistook familiarity for understanding." The revelation also placed new pressure on institutions like schools, religious organizations, and local government to foster deeper connections and create spaces for open dialogue. Group therapy sessions became regular fixtures in Cedar Hollow's community center, offering residents the chance to reflect, not just on what had happened, but on the ways they could rebuild and create a safer environment for everyone. "We need to pay attention to each other," said Catherine Walker, one of the town's deputies. "The biggest mistake we made was assuming we didn't need to check in on one another, or on the kids who might be quietly struggling." Forgiveness and moving forward. Perhaps the most challenging question Cedar Hollow faced was whether forgiveness was possible, not just for William Barnes, but for themselves as a community that had failed to prevent tragedy. Margaret Barnes, who remained in Cedar Hollow despite the intense scrutiny, wrestled with this more than anyone. "I don't know if my son can ever be forgiven," she told a reporter months after the case had been closed. "But I have to believe he can change. I have to hope this doesn't have to define him forever." The town was less certain about its capacity for forgiveness. For many, Melissa Carter's death became a scar that wouldn't fade. Her modern cabin at the edge of the woods, once a symbol of solitude and success, remained vacant, a haunting reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. Still, some residents believed healing was possible. "We're broken," admitted Joanne Lively, "but we're not done. This is a wake-up call if there ever was one." Final takeaways: a wake-up call for everyone. The murder of Melissa Carter wasn't just a tragedy for Cedar Hollow, it was a mirror held up to society as a whole. It revealed the cracks beneath the surface, the isolation of modern life, the dangers of unchecked digital exposure, and the need for stronger emotional connections in our communities. William Barnes's confession, while horrifying, forced the town to ask hard questions about itself, its values, and its vulnerabilities. Sheriff Bishop summed it up best during his final press conference. "This isn't just about one boy or one town, it's about what we've forgotten to teach each other: care, kindness, accountability. If we want to make things better, we don't just lock our doors and hope for the best. We open them, but we open them with purpose, with vigilance, and with a commitment to looking out for one another in ways that matter." As Cedar Hollow tried to rebuild, one lesson emerged above all others: Safety wasn't something they could take for granted anymore. It had to be earned, every day, through understanding, outreach, and a shared responsibility to care for the people around them.